If you'd like, you can go ahead and turn over to Isaiah chapter 5. Isaiah chapter 5. Glad to have our visitors here this morning. If you don't have a Bible, there's one in the pew in front of you there. And if you'll look to page 607, you'll find where we are, but I have to put an asterisk by that. Brandon told me the other day we have 2 editions out there in the auditorium. So if you get to 607 and don't see Isaiah, don't panic. Just let it fall open to the middle to Psalms and then go to the right just a bit. And you'll come across Isaiah pretty soon after that. The Old Testament prophets, I think, are some of the most admirable men that we find. They were put in situations almost beyond belief. And so as we read their writings, we read their teachings, we should have that appreciation for them as men who were committed to God when sometimes it appeared no one else was. One of the greatest of those prophets was Isaiah, not only in the Old Testament, but also in the New Testament, because much of his writings are referenced where the prophecies that he made are being fulfilled. Sometimes the book of Isaiah is called the 5th gospel for all of the messianic prophecies within it. But yet what I want us to see this morning is that in the midst of that great work, Isaiah had to come to a realization about himself. And that realization is something that when we look at it, every one of us has got to come to realize also. And so what I'd like to do is to spend our time this morning here in Isaiah 5 and 6. We'll not look at every verse by any means. But I want us to see what this man had to say and what this man had to realize in the presence of God. As we think about the beginning part of Isaiah chapter 5, the Lord is going to compare His people to a vineyard, and we're going to take a look at that. But before we get to it, I want to see this section and how it's set up. If you think about chapters 5 and 6, you could break it down something like this. This section at the beginning that describes the vineyard of God is going to talk about their abandonment of God. That God was important to them, but yet they leave Him behind, they go their own way. And then when you get over toward the end of this section in chapter 6, verse 9, we'll see the punishments that God's going to bring. Here's a people that had voluntarily entered into a covenant with Him. They had rejected that covenant. The rejection has consequences. And in between that abandonment of God by the people and the punishment that God says is coming, we're going to see 7 woes that the prophet Isaiah announces. So keep that in mind, and as we think about how this section lays out, we go back to this part with the abandonment of God. Again, God comparing His people here to a vineyard. And what God has to say is I did everything for you. I made everything conducive for your growth. And so this initial section is going to keep that metaphor of the vineyard in mind. And he says, here's what I've done. Verse 2, I dug and cleared the stones away. I planted it with choice vines. I built a watchtower in the midst of it, hewed out a wine vat. But then he says, he looked to it to yield grapes. But it yielded wild grapes. God says, everything you needed for success was there. But yet, as you took all of those great blessings, instead of these ripe, good, tamed grapes, instead what you've produced are wild grapes that are no good to anyone. Certainly not someone who spent the time and energy in a vineyard like this. And so God says as a result of that, there's going to be a penalty that comes. Again, keeping in mind the metaphor here, we continue on down. And he says in verse 5, here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to remove the hedge, that it shall be devoured. I'm going to break down its walls so that it can be trampled down. I will lay it waste. It shall not be pruned nor hoed, and briars and thorns will grow up. And I will command the clouds that they rain no rain upon it. God says, I gave you every opportunity for success. You rejected that, and now you're going to see what rejection looks like. You're going to see the problem that's created because of your actions. Now, why did all of this happen? Well, I think we find in verse 7 a pretty good indication why. And I put this up on the screen so that we can see the wordplay that's going on here. He says, here's what I was expecting. Here's what good fruit would have looked like. He said, for the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the men of Judah are his pleasant planting. He looked for justice, but behold bloodshed, for righteousness, but behold an outcry. What would good fruit have looked like according to the Lord? He said it would have looked like a people who were showing justice to those around them. And so when we think about that concept of justice, many times we think about it as retribution. Someone's committed a crime and they're going to pay the price, and that's certainly included, but that's only half the picture. Justice is also restorative. And in the case when God mentions it to the people, many times what it's looking at is you're going out of your way to take care of those who are disadvantaged, those who are on the fringes of society. You're helping them. That's what justice looks like. And righteousness, though we could put many definitions to it, let's just simply say it this way. It's treating people like they're created in God's image. God says, when I went to look for justice, I found bloodshed. When I looked for righteousness, I found an outcry. Those word pairings, the words justice and bloodshed, would look almost identical in the Hebrew language. The words righteousness and outcry would look almost identical. And so here's the prophet Isaiah quoting the Lord, and he's saying, I went to find one thing, and it may look like it, but it is far from what I expected. And so then we think about the ending of chapter 6, and he says, here's what you can now expect. Here's the penalty for not behaving like my covenant people. Chapter 6, verse 9, he says to Isaiah, go and say to this people, keep on hearing, but do not understand. Keep on seeing, but do not perceive. Make the hearts of this people dull, and their ears heavy, and blind their eyes, lest they see with their eyes, and hear with their ears, and understand with their hearts, and turn and be healed. God says, you go tell them they had the opportunity, but that opportunity has now been rescinded. So what do we find then in between this wayward vineyard and the judgment language of God? We've got a picture of what wild grapes look like. While choice grapes look like justice and righteousness, God says, here is what the wild grapes look like, and each of these is going to be dotted with the word woe to begin. Just think about a courtroom scene where the charges are being brought against someone, except in an Old Testament courtroom scene, it usually was with woe that God would introduce that. And so he sends Isaiah now, who actually uses that term several places in his book, but it's going to be the most highly concentrated here in chapter 5, where he's going to pronounce 6 woes on the people within this chapter. And so he begins, first of all, by saying, woe to the land hungry who take for selfish gain. With our time limits this morning, we can't explore everything Isaiah is saying, so let me just give you kind of a synopsis of what these are. You think about the children of Israel, one of the most important things to them was the land, because the land represented their covenant with God. And what Isaiah is saying from the Lord's inspiration is, there are those amongst you who are so greedy that you're going in, and from the very poorest of the landowners, you're taking that land away so that you can develop it, so that you can make money on it. And so he compares them here to these land-hungry, selfish exploiters of the poor. He continues, and he says, woe to those who are drunkards. And in verses 11 and 12, he gives an apt description of them. They're going everywhere. They're finding drinks. They don't know what's going on. And so the picture that you have here is woe to the glutton and woe to the drunkard. The land glutton. and the one who's inside is blinded by alcohol. And he stops here. He pauses. And after these first two woes, he gives two judgments, two therefores. And so the first of those, he says, therefore, verse 13, you're going into exile for what you've done. And in the second of those judgments, the second therefore, he says, you want to know something really ironic? Sheol is going to be the one to devour. In fact, if you look at verse 14, as he describes this, he says, Sheol has enlarged its appetite and opened its mouth beyond measure, and the nobility of Jerusalem and the multitude will go down. Isn't that interesting compared to the first two woes that kind of dealt with eating? You've got a glutton, you've got a drunkard, and in this second judgment, he says it's not you who are going to eat, it's going to be Sheol. And he kind of pictures Sheol, which is the grave, death in the Old Testament, as the monster of chaos that's opening up its jaws wider than usual because it's about to do a whole lot of consuming. He then is going to double his woes. We go from 2 now to 4 woes. And as Isaiah continues on, he's going to say what's about to follow is going to show the contrast that you have with God. Let's look at what he says about God and kind of this link between the two sections. In verses 15 and 16, he says, man is humbled, and each one is brought low, and the eyes of the haughty are brought low. But the Lord of hosts, look at our terms again. The Lord of hosts is exalted in justice, and the holy God shows himself holy in righteousness. So here's the contrast. Though you have turned to bloodshed and outcry instead of justice and righteousness, you will see the God of heaven perfectly illustrating these. And then we have the 4 woes that follow, where he now says, woe to those who are tied to iniquity. It's kind of like a horse in a cart. You're bound up with iniquity, and wherever it goes, you go. Woe to those who are tied to iniquity. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil. If there's any of these woes we can understand in our time, it's this one, where people are taking things that God has said are wicked, corrupt, unclean, polluted, and they're highlighting these as something good and wholesome and acceptable. What we realize is we're not really any different than the times that have come before us. Isaiah is saying, the Lord saying through him, there are those who are taking what's good and turning it on its head, saying it's evil, and taking evil and highlighting as something good. He continues on, and he says, woe to those who are wise in their own eyes. They're the ones making all of these judgments not from God's wisdom, but from their own. And then I've just kind of summarized this 4th woe, in which God says, woe to those blinded to justice and righteousness. He goes back to the drunken metaphor once again, but this time it's people who are just so caught up in themselves that they're blinded to the very things that would have made them that good fruit that God desired. So we had 2 woes, 2 therefore judgments. Now we've got 4 woes, 2 more judgments are going to come. And he says, therefore, fire is going to devour the stubble. He's setting our scene here as though a fire breaks out in a very dry field that's maybe been harvested, but there's a little bit left. And he says the one who's going to start that fire is the Lord. Therefore, the anger of the Lord is kindled. God is going to take action for these things that you've committed. So here we have these 6 woes. Here we've got 4 judgments. And so it feels like that God is building to a crescendo in His thought, and we come to chapter 6, and seemingly it's like the whole scene changes. That we just drop where we were, And we pick up now with what sometimes is called the prophet Isaiah's calling. Other folks will call it the recommissioning of Isaiah. I don't know which it is. What I understand, though, is its placement in the book is essential. That the reason that this isn't at the beginning, as if it's his calling, is because it's not a break-in topic. It's very much a continuing. And so suddenly we get this scene with Isaiah where he's standing in the temple of God. And here is God, not the Ark of the Covenant, but God Himself, who is there in His most holy place. And above Him we find the seraphim. And they're flying over Him, and they're singing to one another, answering one another, and they're saying, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord." So here in the presence of God, these heavenly beings are crying out about who He is. And this holiness that they're talking about is what makes God uniquely God. There is no one else who can have this holiness because it alone belongs to God. And what makes God holy in this way is another aspect of it, where He has a purity about Him that has never been corrupted, nor will it be corrupted. We think about an eternal being who is always good, who is always pure, who is always holy. And as these seraphim cry out to one another about the holiness of God, they end that little song, maybe in a somewhat surprising way, verse 3 of chapter 6. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of His, we might expect, holiness. But what they say here is, the whole earth is filled with His glory. And what I believe we are to take from that is the visible manifestations of the holiness of God is this glory that we find throughout the earth. And so the seraphim are saying, if you look, you see God wherever you are, because who He is constitutes what He does, which is allow that holiness to be seen in action. Now, if you remember back in chapter 5, we left it with 6 woes. And biblically, that seems like we're not done, right? Because often in the Bible, things are going to be in groups of 7. And that's the case here. Because now we find why chapter 6 is where it is. Why this information about Isaiah is where it is. Because after he sees this sight and he hears the song of the seraphim, he cries out his 7th woe, which is not against the people of Israel, not against the people of Judah, it's against himself. He says, "Woe is me, for I am undone. I am dead," is what that word undone means, or lost in some translations. Here is a man who is standing in the temple, in the presence of the holy God, and as he looks upon God and as he thinks about himself, he says, "I am worthy of death." Because remember in the Old Testament, to look upon God sometimes constitutes death, doesn't it? It's what God told Moses. He said, "You can't look upon my face." And yet here is Isaiah standing in the very presence of God, and he says, "The reason I feel this way is because I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of those with unclean lips." Isaiah has made a realization about himself. For the first 5 chapters, he has been in hard conversation with the people, pointing out error, pointing out sin, pointing out their covenant violations. But now he realizes, I'm a part of this group. Now, many times the prophets will identify themselves with the people. I don't know that that's what Isaiah is doing. I believe Isaiah is stating for himself, I realize that I have got to change. Though I have been called to be a prophet of God, I am a human who is standing unworthy before God. And as this scene continues to unfold, God takes action on this. He sends one of His heavenly beings with a pair of tongs, takes a coal out of the altar and brings it, and He touches it to the lips of Isaiah, and He says, "Your guilt is removed." A very godlike scene with fire, but also a very godlike scene of forgiveness. And He says, "I have taken away your guilt, and I have atoned for your sins. I've paid the ransom." And so in this vision, that hot coal from the altar is representing the burning away of the uncleanness and the filth. And when that happens, Isaiah can then hear the voice of God. As God makes His cry, "Whom shall I send, and who shall go for us?" Now, as we think about this grand scene, both in the judgment of God, this vision of God, the reaction of the prophets, all of this, I hope, is helping us to get a better grasp on this idea that we've been exploring for the last month and a half, on being holy as God is holy. And as we think about this great scene, I want to leave you this morning with some thoughts that we can get from it that are preliminary for, Lord willing, things that are going to come in the next few weeks. That as we look at what Isaiah learns from all of this, it's going to help us to learn those things about holiness also. And one of the chief of those that we must understand is that holiness belongs solely to God. Now, the word holy can be used in other ways. But when we start talking about the holiness of God or being holy as God is holy, that belongs totally to Him. Which could leave us in a conundrum if we're told to be holy as God is holy. But what that means for us is that we must come to the understanding that we cannot come to be holy until we are one with God. That's what holiness is all about. This is not some kind of metaphysical Far Eastern idea. It's just simply the idea that my will is going to be His will. That I'm getting myself out of the way so that I can be filled with God. Now, what's got to happen first? Well, I think Paul helps us with that. As he's writing to the Corinthians, he says, "For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ." How do I become one with God? Well, what Paul is saying is when you're baptized for the forgiveness of your sins, you are added to the body of Christ. You're a part of God now in that sense. And he goes on and he says, "For in one Spirit we were all baptized into one body, Jews and Greeks, slaves and free. We were all made to drink of one Spirit." So here I am. I'm in the one body of God. I'm with the one Spirit of God. It is now that I'm a part of God that I can know that holiness. But remember, something's got to happen first. And that's the atonement that we find. The ransom that had to be paid. In Isaiah's vision, it's the heavenly being coming with that coal of fire. For us, it's the understanding that someone had to pay the price. Someone had to pay the ransom. And that's Jesus Christ. And the heavenly scenes in the book of Revelation illustrate this. As they sang a new song, Revelation 5:9 tells us, saying, "Worthy are you to take the scroll and to open its seals. For you were slain," singing this about Jesus. "And by your blood you ransomed the people for God from every tribe and language and people and nation." How can I be one with God? It's through the terrible price that had to be paid for my sins so that I could come to Him and I could know the grace of God as I go down in the waters of baptism and God says, it's now I see you trust me, your sins are forgiven. And I'm brought into His body. That's what I must understand. I must also understand the influence that those around me can have. I've often wondered about this statement with Isaiah, and it's one of those times you just love to be able to ask him, what are you saying by this? But I think what he's saying is maybe something like this: I didn't realize what was happening. But now that I am confronted with the Lord of heaven, God on His throne, I can see the influence that my culture, that my people have had on me. And that is something, no matter when you live, you got to realize that when you are dwelling in the midst of a people, very subtly sometimes, but nonetheless true, things can rub off. That phrase, dwell in the midst, you'll find it used in a positive and negative way in the Bible. You go back to Genesis chapter 2, this is what God desired, wasn't it? For God and man to live together, for Him to dwell in the midst of His people. Zechariah is going to echo that He's desiring this relationship with humanity. But it's also used, as is the case here, in the sense of that danger, that influence that can make one unclean. And that's where Isaiah is. And if we are very honest with ourselves, we can realize how easily that can happen to us. That as culture begins to take its downward slide, we may not think it's influencing us until we stand in the presence of God. It's not going to be like Isaiah in that vision. It's going to be in reading His Word and finding who He's like. And I look at that and I realize what's happened. Well, let's make that a little more specific. Sometimes Christians who behave badly can have an influence on us. I hope to explore this idea a little bit further next week, but just in summary here. How easy it is for us to come together as a people of God and to think everything's okay, but yet to have things that are not right about us that can have those influences on others, that can make us like the prophet Isaiah of unclean lips, living in the midst of a people of unclean lips. We think about a lack of respect for His authority. We think about lack of commitment to purity. We think about a lack of responsibility in the use of our time and our resources and our money. All of these things can have that negative influence, and we don't want to be that way. We don't want to be influenced, and we don't want to be the influencer of that. And thus a lesson that we gain in being holy is to understand what Isaiah went through in that realization. One of the strongest things I think we find standing out in this section, especially in chapter 5, is God specifically saying through His example, holiness is manifest in justice and righteousness. Those are two words that, if we're not careful, sound kind of religion-y, sound kind of fuzzy and cloudy, and we really don't know what they mean. That is not how God uses them. Because God says, if you are just and you are righteous, you're going to be like me. You remember what He said earlier? The Lord is exalted in justice. The Lord shows Himself holy in righteousness. He says, if you're going to be holy as I am holy, if you're going to share in the holiness that makes up God, then what that means is you better treat people made in God's image appropriately. Whether that be in your actions or whether that be in your words. That the things you're saying, the things you're doing, the things you're not doing. He says all of these are a way of knowing whether or not you're holy as I am holy. And with that, it's being a voice for those who are mistreated. How many times can we find in the Bible where God is saying to His people, one of the ways I know that you're with me is when you look at these people on the fringes of society and you're concerned about them and you're taking care of them and you're feeding them and you're giving them clothing and you're seeing to their medical needs. That hasn't changed. It hasn't changed. And so God says, if you're going to share in my holiness, these people who are so unimportant to the human world, they're some of the people you better be thinking about the most. Because I'm exalted in justice. And holiness is shown in righteousness. And that's what I desire of you. And then finally I would say, what it should do to us is that, like Isaiah, we are ready for the work of the Lord. After his purification, Isaiah hears the Lord say, "Who shall I send? Who shall go for us?" And Isaiah says, "Could you give me some of the details about your expectations before I make any commitments here?" Is that what he said? He said, "Here am I, send me." Before he had any idea what the job was. And that's when God begins and He says, go to them, and they're not going to listen to you. They're not going to respect you. You just prophesy on. How long, Lord? Till I devastate their cities. In other words, till you know that this has come to pass. What an attitude that Isaiah had. Because he was cleansed. He was ransomed. And he wanted to be holy as the Lord is holy. And I would suggest to you that as we do that in our own very small way, what we are doing is we are helping to fill the earth with the glory of God. When I am willing to do the Lord's work, to take the Lord's work wherever it needs to go, I'm filling the earth with His glory. Isaiah was an amazing man, and his book is an amazing writing, but it's a practical writing. And it shows us that if we are going to be as God would have it, then what we must do is to be a clean, holy, dedicated person in His service. So let's remember this. There's only one way to God's holiness. If we try to be holy on our own, that's what Jesus will call self-righteousness. You think you're good because of who you are. He says, no, when you sin, you've abandoned God. But through my atonement, through the ransom I pay, you can be one with me. You can be in me and share in that Spirit. And I hope this morning that if that does not describe you as being one with God, you're ready to do that. That you're ready to come and to receive that grace that God offers, that mercy that He offers. To stand and to say, I believe that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. To be buried in the waters of baptism for the forgiveness of your sins. And to be raised up to share in the holiness of God. If that once describes you, but like Isaiah, you find yourself an unclean person in the midst of unclean people. Like Isaiah, God will forgive you. He's promised that. And if we can pray with you about that, we'll do so this morning. Whatever it takes. Let's be ready to go where God sends. To be a holy people who are sharing in that holiness of God. If you need to respond to His invitation, you can come now as we stand and sing together.